Welcome to the debate. Today, we're digging into a really interesting piece from the Deep Dive called Myth Busting: Why Everything You Think About Traditional Family Life is Wrong. Now, the idea of a traditional family, well, it's something many of us recognize, maybe from old TV shows or, cultural ideals, perhaps even our own lives. But the world keeps changing, right? How people connect, build lives, form families, it's all in flux. So we have to ask, is this concept of a traditional family an enduring, adaptable model we should aspire to for societal well-being? Or is it maybe fundamentally flawed, even mythical, and maybe pursuing it causes more problems than it solves? We have two perspectives with us today. One argues for the, let's say, enduring value and the adaptability of these core traditional family ideals. Basically, that the human desire for connection and stability is, well, powerful and persistent.
Our other perspective argues that the traditional family is often actually a detrimental myth, a blueprint that's caused a lot of harm when it's applied too rigidly. I'll be arguing for the enduring value perspective today.
And I'll be arguing that it's often a harmful myth.
All right. So let's start with the position that sees enduring value in these core ideals. As the advocate, let me lay that out. Look, let's be clear right away. I absolutely acknowledge the historical shifts and, the documented flaws of that specific 1950s ideal. You know the picture, the suburban house, dad coming home from work, mom in the kitchen. We can't just ignore the realities of that particular era. But my core argument is that the fundamental human desire for stable, committed family structures, well, it runs much deeper than that specific image. It's genuinely ancient, it's persistent. So the focus, I think, shouldn't be on just dismissing this underlying drive, but rather on understanding how these aspirations, show up and adapt over time.
I mean, look at some modern examples. There was that Grindr survey. Kind of surprising, maybe. It found over half of its Gen Z users actually want marriage and monogamy. Or think about how marriage itself is viewed today, often like a capstone achievement, something people aim for after they've got their career going, after they feel financially stable. These aren't rejections of partnership. I think they strongly suggest that the quest for a functional, dedicated family unit is still a really significant and often beneficial driver in people's lives. The key idea here for me is that the human need for deep commitment, for stable partnership, it's fundamentally resilient. It just finds new ways to express itself, maybe on a different timeline in our modern world. Societies have, they've always looked for frameworks for family life, which shows an enduring need for these kinds of structures.
Okay, a strong opening there, pointing to that persisting human drive. Dissenter, you're coming at this quite differently, arguing the traditional family isn't just fluid, but often a destructive myth. Tell us why you see it that way.
Yeah, I see it very differently. For me, the traditional family isn't just fluid. It's often, frankly, a destructive myth, especially when people try to apply it rigidly, like some kind of instruction manual. That popular 1950s image, the one the advocate just mentioned, the one that pops into everyone's head, it was essentially a specific cultural experiment. And honestly, that experiment seemed to prioritize, economic efficiency, convenience almost, over any real relational depth. And this approach, it had significant negative consequences that, we're still grappling with today. Dads, for instance, were often reduced to just being breadwinners, right? And frequently became pretty emotionally distant from their families. Moms experienced what Betty Friedan so powerfully called the problem that has no name, feeling isolated in domestic loneliness, even though they were supposedly living the dream.
Even teens in those supposedly idyllic suburbs showed higher rates of delinquency and detachment, as James Coleman found back in 1960. What's really telling is that institutions, like churches even, they sort of mirrored this fragmentation by splitting up ministries, one for the men, one for the women, one for the youth, further isolating family members. So the crucial insight here, I think, is that chasing after a rigid ideal, even one that looks good on the surface, can create these huge hidden burdens and unintended social problems. Trying to recapture that flawed experiment today with rigid gender roles, it just leads to the same problems, the same vulnerabilities. So I just don't buy that the ideal itself isn't problematic. It's not just about how it was carried out.
Okay, both of you have laid out really compelling initial positions. The advocate pointing to an enduring aspiration for stability, while the dissenter highlights the often detrimental realities of specific historical attempts to define traditional. Let's kick off our core debate by really digging into this idea of historical evolution versus enduring aspirations. Advocate, you suggested that while family forms change, the core functions remain constant. Can you elaborate on that resilience, especially thinking about the criticisms the dissenter just outlined?
Absolutely. Think about early American families, for example. Women and children weren't just, sitting around. They were absolutely essential economic partners, deeply involved in the household's ability to produce things and survive. Then, later in the 19th century, we see the rise of what historians Mentz and Kellogg called companionate marriage, where the focus shifted more towards emotional bonds, not just purely economic arrangements. My point is, these are profound adaptations. They were driven by the economy, by demographics, by women's changing roles, but they weren't an abandonment of the family unit itself. The family still provided crucial functions: stability, raising kids, mutual support. Now sure, maybe the standard version we often think of was often a middle-class white thing and how it was specifically described or promoted. But I'd argue it reflected a broader societal ideal of a dedicated family structure that many people aspired to, even if economic limits meant they couldn't achieve that specific version. The aspiration, the desire for that functional unit persisted.
That's a fascinating perspective on adaptation over time. Dissenter, you raised some very serious concerns earlier about rigidity and power dynamics. How do you view this historical arc? Does it really show an enduring aspiration, or does it reveal something, well, more problematic about these evolving forms?
Well, I challenge that narrative of enduring aspirations because I think it often papers over the rigidity and the very real human costs embedded in those historical family models. The advocate mentioned early American families. Okay, but let's not forget the pretty harsh, puritanical view of children back then. They were seen as inherently sinful, their wills needed breaking, sometimes they were even fostered out to other families for discipline and training. That doesn't sound very aspirational to me. And the advocate touched on companionate marriage, but that still operated within a system where, for instance, legal ideas like coverture were common.
Right, and just to remind listeners, coverture was that historical legal principle where a married woman's legal identity basically vanished. It was disappeared legally into her husband. She couldn't own property independently, couldn't sue. A really stark example of those power dynamics.
Exactly, thank you. Those structures reveal something far from universally aspirational, I'd argue, given the human cost. And industrialization. It didn't just allow some ideal family to adapt. It forced a new, sharp line between the public world of work and the private world of home. This fundamentally changed family life, often at the expense of women and children, who, let's be honest, in many working-class families, still had to work, just maybe not in factories, defined as the public sphere. So my concern there is that this aspiration often came with significant, often unacknowledged, societal and personal costs baked right in.
I see why you highlight those darker aspects, dissenter. And yeah, the historical record is definitely full of those kinds of challenges. But even within those difficult, sometimes harsh realities, wasn't there still a drive for stability, for belonging, for, passing something on? Even if the societal structures around it were flawed, those core human needs, they didn't just disappear. They tried to find expression within whatever norms existed at the time. My point is, the impulse, that deep need, remains, even if the forms it takes can be, and often were, problematic.
A compelling point about underlying human needs persisting even amidst difficult structures. Okay, let's pivot now to the economic realities shaping family life today, particularly the evolving roles of women. Advocate, you highlighted some economic theories and insights on two-income households earlier. How do you see those shaping this traditional ideal now?
Yeah. Women's shifting roles are, without doubt, a primary driver of change. I mean, you can look at Gary Becker's economic argument, for example. He suggested that specialization, one partner focusing on earning, the other on homemaking, could potentially contribute to marital stability.
However, the rise of two-income households, which Valerie Oppenheimer wrote about extensively, was often a very rational response to shaky male wages and inflation. So this illustrates, I think, not a rejection of partnership or family, but a pragmatic renegotiation of roles within the family structure aimed at achieving financial security. And the increasing trend of cohabitation or marriage becoming that sort of capstone achievement, often for people with higher earnings, well, that further shows that people still deeply value stability and partnership. They're simply adapting to new economic conditions where often financial independence comes before marriage. The underlying aspiration for a stable, committed unit remains, even if the pathway to achieving it looks fundamentally different.
Dissenter, you've mentioned that this shift is also about liberation, about exposing vulnerabilities. How does that perspective fit with the advocate's point about pragmatic renegotiation?
Well, I think it's crucial to view women's increasing employment not just as a shift, but as a necessary liberation from structures that had become economically and frankly, emotionally unsustainable for many. The advocate mentioned Oppenheimer, and another key point she made was that working was essentially insurance against divorce for women. Why? Because, as she put it, homemaking skills don't exactly transfer if the marriage ends. Now, that fundamentally challenges the whole idea that women's independence somehow destabilizes marriage. No. Instead, it exposes the inherent vulnerabilities and the economic dependencies that were created by those older, traditional roles. The crucial insight for me is that economic empowerment for women often makes families more resilient, not less, because it reduces that dependency. And let's just look at today's realities. I mean, the sheer cost, what is it, $250,000 to raise kids before college? And the fact that something like 72% of people who want kids cite cost as a huge barrier. These numbers just underscore how that old traditional model of one primary breadwinner is simply inadequate, financially impossible for many today. This forces new, sometimes radical, adaptive strategies that move way beyond the old blueprint. So it's not just renegotiation. In many ways, it's a necessary dismantling of an unsustainable model.
That really does put the economic pressures into sharp relief. Advocate, when you hear about these significant financial barriers and the liberation aspect that a center brings up, does it change your view on whether the traditional ideal is still truly aspirational or perhaps just a luxury available only to some?
I definitely hear the point about the very real economic pressures, dissenter. And yes, the costs of raising a family today are staggering. It certainly makes that specific 1950s model feel unattainable, perhaps even undesirable for many. However, the fact that people still want marriage, that they still desire children despite these incredible costs, that to me indicates the aspiration itself is still there. It's simply that the means to achieve a stable family life have become far more complex and, often require two incomes or significant financial stability beforehand. It's not that the aspiration is gone. It's that the pathway demands more adaptation, more resilience, and often, as I said, more financial independence before forming that unit. The ideal of a supportive partnership, of building a stable home, that remains, I believe, even if the division of labor looks completely different.
That's a powerful distinction you're making, the aspiration versus the practical path. Okay, let's move to our third key point, which touches on societal efforts to, quote, manage family life and includes the impact of our digital age. Advocate, you noted a continuous, systemic effort to support family structures. How do you see that playing out historically and maybe even today?
Yeah, I think if you look across history, we've seen these repeated systemic efforts by society to support family structures, which to me implies a recognition of their foundational importance. Think back to the progressive era, with its belief in scientific management for the home and scientific motherhood. These were conscious attempts, however flawed may be, to optimize domestic life. Then you have the New Deal, a period of massive government intervention, creating foundational programs like the Social Security Act, which provided crucial support to families. And even today, we see things like, AI tools being designed as co-pilots for managing your parenting life. This sustained effort, even if it's imperfect, reveals that we recognize the family unit isn't just, a random collection of individuals. It's seen as fundamental to society. And in the digital age, even dating apps, right? Despite all the frustrations people have with them, they are, in a way, a modern manifestation of that deep human need for connection, for love, for family formation. You see niche apps popping up, features like AI wingmen. These are adaptations trying to facilitate these fundamental human desires in new ways. It shows that the drive for connection, it transcends the medium, really.
Okay, so these efforts, these tools are reflections of a continuous foundational societal drive to support family. Dissenter, you've suggested that many of these attempts to manage families have often imposed idealized, maybe flawed norms rather than genuinely supporting diverse family forms. How do you see the digital age connecting with that critique?
Well, I definitely challenge the idea that these historical attempts to manage families were always about genuine support. Often they ended up imposing external, frequently idealized and frankly flawed norms, rather than actually supporting the diverse ways families already existed or wanted to exist. Take the paradox of labor-saving devices in the home, things like washing machines. You'd think they'd reduce housework, right? But often they actually increased it because societal standards of cleanliness and domesticity just rose to meet the new potential. This illustrates a really crucial insight. Technological improvements can paradoxically create more burdens, more pressure, if the underlying cultural expectations aren't challenged or addressed. And similarly, dating apps, sure, they fulfill a need for connection. But they also often contribute to what some sociologists call a collect trap mentality, where the sheer volume of choice makes it paradoxically harder to commit, harder to find genuine connection. And they can definitely exacerbate existing problems like male loneliness or very real safety concerns for women. My worry is that these new tools sometimes just mimic old, flawed structures, but in a new digital format. The real solution, I believe, lies not in finding new tools to try to manage or optimize according to some outdated blueprint, but in actively fostering respect, transparency, and intention. Those should be the real currency for authentic connection, whether it happens online or off. And that needs to be independent of these old traditional blueprints, focusing instead on the quality of connection, not just the quantity or the technology used to find it.
That's a really challenging perspective, dissenter, suggesting that sometimes our attempts at solutions can actually reinforce existing burdens or create new ones. Advocate, do you see any merit in that critique? That perhaps these efforts, while maybe well-intentioned, can sometimes miss the mark or even perpetuate flawed expectations?
Oh, I absolutely agree that intention doesn't always equal perfect outcomes. And that paradox of increased housework with labor-saving devices, it's a brilliant and slightly depressing example of exactly that. It really highlights the dynamic tension between our aspirations and how things actually play out, doesn't it? My core point, however, remains that the continuous effort itself, society's ongoing attempt to support family life, even through these imperfect means, like government programs or new technologies, it speaks to an underlying recognition of its profound value. Dating apps, for all their documented flaws, are still, I think, a testament to that persistent human drive for connection. They aren't perfect, not by a long shot, but they show people are still actively seeking those foundational relationships, even if the tools themselves need to evolve quite a bit to better support authentic connection over just, endless swiping and a collect trap.
This has been a truly illuminating discussion, really covering a lot of ground. Advocate, in light of our conversation, how would you briefly summarize your core position now?
Well, I'd say that while the specific forms and societal expectations around family life are undeniably dynamic, constantly changing, the core human drive for connection, for stability, for nurturing the next generation, that endures. The ongoing adaptation of structures, from early American family economies right through to modern cohabitation trends, and even how we use technology to seek partnership. It all demonstrates a profound resilience in the face of immense change. So the challenge, as I see it, isn't to abandon the aspiration for a functional, supportive family unit, but rather to continuously adapt its structure and support systems with, hopefully, grace, compassion, and a clear understanding of its historical fluidity. And yes, leveraging new tools and policies thoughtfully to reinforce its enduring value.
Thank you. And dissenter, how do you see it now having debated these points? Your summary.
My position remains that the concept of the traditional family, particularly when viewed as some kind of fixed blueprint, is a deeply ingrained and often detrimental myth. It's largely rooted in a specific and frankly often failed mid-century experiment that created immense hidden burdens, especially for women and children. True resilience, I believe, lies not in clinging to an outdated ideal, but in our collective comfort with flux, with change, and our ability to shed these rigid ideals that no longer serve us, or perhaps never truly did. Progress for me demands embracing the diverse, evolving forms that family life takes today, and actively building genuinely resilient, emotionally healthy homes and communities. And that requires real intentionality and systemic support, not repeatedly trying to recreate or just tweak a flawed and often harmful past.
Well, it's certainly clear that family life is inherently complex, isn't it? And continuously changing, subject to huge economic, social, and technological pressures. What this discussion really highlights, I think, is the critical importance of understanding that fluidity and looking closely at the various ways individuals and societies are navigating those fundamental human needs for connection in family formation today. We've explored whether striving for a traditional ideal helps or perhaps hinders that navigation. And it really leaves us, and hopefully our listeners, to ponder what truly constitutes well-adjusted or successful in this constantly shifting landscape. Thank you both for a really thoughtful and challenging debate today.